especially with the panel that we have, which is actually very exciting. I was going through everyone's bios and looking them up, and I'm quite excited.
I think Sync must be having an issue. We're just going to wait a few minutes as we try to sort it out.
All right, everyone, I'm back on. Can you hear me? All right, great. Sorry, so clearly we need to start the conversation with Wi-Fi in Africa. Where is it now and where could it go, right? No, but like I was saying, I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. And so I'd just like to introduce our three speakers for the panel. So I'll start with William Shoki, and please, if I'm mispronouncing names, let me know. William Shoki is a staff writer for Africa is a Country, which is basically a site described as one of opinion and analysis written by Africans from the perspective of the African left, right? We also have with us Kiki Mordi, who is a Nigerian investigative journalist, filmmaker, writer, entrepreneur, who is known for a number of different works, one of them being a documentary on BBC titled Sex for Grades, where she basically exposed a history of sexual harassment in in a couple of African countries with West African lecturers. And then finally, we have Makeda Mahedeo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She's a YouTuber, accomplished content creator, DJ who's held talks with all over the place with TEDx, I believe I saw recently as well. So everyone, I just like to say thank you for being here and for being part of the conversation. And I'll just kick it off, actually, starting from Makeda. And so my question would be, Makeda, what do you think makes African art African?
Such a simple question that is just so layered sometimes. But look, what I think it is when Africans tell their stories, right? So I'm an African, I'm talking about my experience. I think what I'm making is African art, right? And that's really what it comes down to for me. If you're an African and you're making art, you're making African art. And I think that's kind of the important part. And it doesn't really matter what kind of art you're making. And I do know that it can get a little bit blurred if other people are making African inspired art, you know, people from outside of the continent, that's actually good art, you know, but is it African? I don't feel that it is very often. I don't feel that it's African. I think it should be appreciated.
So I'm trying to see,
but it doesn't feel African.
And get an angle.
So that's my opinion.
Great. Sorry, let me just remind everybody, the participants for the moment, to mute themselves. I believe we'll be taking questions at the end. Thank you, Makeda. That was great. So it's interesting you say that, because I believe you're right. There is a blur that's usually associated when people think of African art. You know, does it have to be something that's rooted in, for example, tribes? In my country of Kenya, you know, tribes are a very big thing, right? So does it have to be something authentic in that space, or could you write a love story? right? And have that be African, right? Without necessarily including a ton of other things. So I'd love to hear what William thinks on that point, even just from a writing perspective, right? Writing as an African to Africans. What's your perspective on that?
Thanks, Sinke, and thanks to the McGill African Student Society for having us all today. Yeah, this is, as Makeda was saying now, it's a simple question, but it is layered. And I think something I'm often confronting as a writer, interacting with other writers and communities of writers, is the question of the usefulness of the designation African to begin with, whether or not you're talking about art or literature or film or whatever medium of expression. At what point do we determine whether or not that designation helps us achieve something, or whether or not it kind of traps us in a sort of self-referential place when the only way we can interact with the rest of the world is through our Africanness? And I think, I mean, just by way of example, when you consume a lot of art that's produced in the West, it's just art, right? It's kind of not really treated as European or American or whatever. And it's only sort of products from the global South when those designations start to come into play. And I'm constantly going back and forth between, on the one hand, understanding the importance of that designation as a way of sort of announcing that this is art that's been made in Africa or writing from Africa, and it has an unapologetically African perspective. But on the other hand, also feeling like that kind of undermines the ability for Africanness to truly be universal, so to speak, in the same way that we treat other cultural production from other places as supposedly being universal.
No, that's great. And I couldn't agree more. It's something I believe that you know, it can be felt from many different sides, not even just as African, right? For us who are, let's say, Black, right? So when we put out, there can be this idea that when we put out content, it could be labeled as, you know, Black content or content for Black people, right? When in reality, it's just content. And so Kiki, I'd pass the question to you, especially from a filmmaking perspective and from, you know, the whole journalist side, right? When you're reporting about African stories, when I was reading about the BBC when I was reading about the BBC documentary, I was thinking specifically of this question, because essentially it is very rooted in Africa, but it's not something that's unique to Africa, right? So I'd love to hear what you think about this as well.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you that we have like problems that are 100% rooted in Africa, but not necessarily an Africa-specific problem, which is where I would always side with, you know, that school of thoughts of Chimamanda, the dangers of a single story. There is no part of us that deserves erasure. And we don't have to fit into like one box for it to be essentially an African story. The fact that it's told by an African is relevant enough for it to be called an African story. And so when we want to interact with like the story inside of us, sometimes there is that limitation of the politicization that, you know, that happens everywhere. For example, if I want to talk about hair, as an African woman, I have to navigate that hair, you know, that Blackness as a thing exists, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, and sometimes that doesn't intersect with Africanness because there is a lot of context that has been removed from us and taken to like other shores, like the US, for example. And so the politics sometimes just prevents us from simply telling a story. But with every other storyteller, like regardless of your medium, I would always just say, tell the story, you know, like remove the barriers of what you think is acceptable or what you think is political and simply tell that story and tell all of it. Do not erase or hide any aspect of the story. When we did the investigations on sexual harassment, of course, sexual harassment is not just an African thing or a Nigerian thing or a Ghanaian thing. And many people felt that we had to hide that aspect of us. But I'd say like every Nigerian woman is as Nigerian as the next person. And every woman in all those universities universities in Ghana matter. And if we're telling a story that is excluding them in the name of protecting Africa and trying to tell only the best stories, we're only doing ourselves a disservice. We will continue to allow the wrong things to thrive because we're trying to tell a perfect story when we simply should have just been telling a story. So yeah, that's my perspective of storytelling when it comes to telling stories as an African. I have faced like many like pushbacks because you're telling only the bad stories. I do tell good stories and feel good stories, but I cannot only tell those stories. I have to tell like the whole story. So
Yeah, no, completely. And in fact, you've kind of stepped us into the next question very well, and which was about what drew you to your work, right? And so what I'm hearing, especially for you, is the passion to tell a story.
yeah.
Some stories which are not being told, or like you said, are kind of pushed aside and silenced, right? So I just want to know, is there anything else that drew you to your work? What was the inspiration behind going into investigative journalism and uncovering all these stories?
Well, I mean, personal experiences definitely had a huge role to play. But it was also just a navigation of different aspects of being a journalist or different aspects of being a storyteller, not just being confined to one. Because I started out as a radio broadcaster, and then I discovered I could do like so many other things. And then I tried my hands at TV. I tried my hands at social media communications, and I discovered investigative journalism and how impactful it could be. It literally is the most impact that I feel like I had made. Just the scale of it was, huge. And I mean, right now I'm making films, and I think that that's also another way to tell stories. And so it's just me not being confined to like one aspect of storytelling. I cannot tell you for a fact how come it is only storytelling that I'm doing. It just happened to be, but yeah, much of it is driven by personal experiences and my love and passion for like wanting to, do something about a problem.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And so I'd like to address the same question to you, Makeda, especially in the realm of content creation, with social media, with this new realm of expression that has obviously taken the world by storm, but is really, really having an impact, especially in Africa. With people being able to create personalities for themselves, become famous, make a ton of money, you know what I mean, do great things in the community. What was behind your decision to step into that space?
It wasn't like that when I stepped into that space. It wasn't like folks were getting rich and stuff like that at that time. I kind of just started doing it because I had moved recently at that time to Rwanda. And it was my first time even being in the country after growing up in Jamaica. And so I'm half Jamaican and half Rwandan. And so I kind of grew up kind of thinking about it, being curious. I didn't grow up with my Rwandan parent. And so I made my way to Rwanda by myself, despite kind of being a bit afraid and not having that much information, especially from my mom, my Jamaican mom, or anybody in my family. And when I came, I just was so taken with everything that I saw. I was just having so much fun discovering everything. I was so interested in all of the culture. I mean, I knew so much about Jamaica. I traveled the whole country. My family was very, very serious about making sure that we knew all the culture. And when I came here, I knew so little that it was just like being a sponge. And so I ended up kind of just documenting that, taking videos, mostly to just show my mom and, show her it's safe here, it's fun here. I wanted to show other young people because I couldn't find anything online at all about Rwanda, except for, about genocide or maybe gorillas. And so I just felt like I had to tell stories about regular everyday life, what young people like me were doing. You know, I talked about learning Kinyarwanda, the language here, all my entire journey of kind of coming into this identity that I never really knew. And I felt kind of just naturally very, very compelled to tell those stories. And the more I did it, the more I wanted to tell more stories and more stories. And that's kind of how I even got into going into the news after that and doing other things on TV. And it kind of led me to where I am now, wanting to do more, you know, television shows and films.
Mhm. Fantastic.
Long
Oh,
story,
great.
sorry.
No, it's great. And I think that, you know, the great thing about asking these questions especially is that there's a bunch of people who are listening to this right now, and listening to both of you and thinking like, yeah, you know, that's what I want. You know, that's something that I really connect with. And so it's great how, you know, you've both kind of been able to create a career for yourself out of these passions of like telling stories, right? And like you're saying, Makeda, out of exploring this new identity that you are kind of like, you know, it had always been part of you, but it was something that you were still learning about, you know. So William, now to just a question to you, especially as a writer and as a fellow writer, I love the art of storytelling as well, right? And being able to kind of communicate entire scenario situations, you know, worlds in a piece of literature. Right. And so I'd wonder where was the inspiration for you? Was it something that happened when you were much, much younger, or was it something really recent that kind of hit you like a Damascus moment or something?
No, I think with most people, you always develop a passion for writing when you're young. And
Yes.
as Makeda and Kiki are talking about, you know, when you're storytelling is such a, I think, an essential component of African life. That's how we come to know about our family histories, about our culture, about so many things. So from a young age, you're already brought up into the world of storytelling, and you try to give concrete expression to that by reading, interacting with the world around you and all of that. But I think the way I sort of ended up where I am now, which is doing a different kind of writing or a sort of commentary on African politics and topics like that. I think that just came from feeling like the media landscape, at least in South Africa, was such that we weren't telling the stories of the marginalized. So the structure of our media landscape is that it's mostly a chattering class of elites that are talking to each other. And we're a country that's highly unequal, that has high rates of poverty, and like a lot of places on the continent are grappling with its sort of post-colonial legacy, but have only seen a lot of the patterns of domination from colonial times outlast the sort of transition into democracy. So I think it just came from a political awakening. So a kind of Damascus moment, but a political one, and just wanting to feel like the plight of the marginalized had to be spotlighted and done in a way that doesn't just, you know, I could never be a spokesperson for anyone, but rather sort of investing in participating in those communities, talking to people and hearing their perspectives on what they think the problems of the country are, how they think the country should be run, and all of those questions, which I think are debates that I think in South Africa, especially, the marginalized are excluded from. So I think that's really what inspired me to pursue the path that I'm on now. It's like with everyone, a desire to tell stories, and especially the stories that I felt weren't being heard.
Oh, fantastic. That's really great. And so like I'd want to ask the entire panel, right? So I really want to bring it clear is that we are privileged, I think all four of us, in the sense that I believe we're all in Africa at the moment, right? William, I know that you're in South Africa. Makeda, you're in Rwanda?
Yeah.
Great. And Kiki, you're in Nigeria at the moment?
Not at the moment. I'm in London at the moment, but yeah, Nigeria is my home. Yeah, that's where I live.
No problem. So What I experienced when I was in Canada, and especially when I was in McGill, and maybe a lot of the people on this call can relate to that, is finding African art when you're abroad, right?
Mm.
Whether that's films, whether it's stories, documentaries, whether it's books, finding those things. Obviously, the internet has made it a bit better, but for old school people like me, I love the physical books, right? So for people who are looking for African art, the three of you, right? And I can start. I'll start with Makeda. Just one piece of art each, I guess, for time. What would you suggest? I mean, your favorite. You have to do a quick analysis. What would you suggest, or what have you seen recently that you'd recommend people check out?
See, it's not fair because now Kiki and William, they got time to think about it. I'm silly. Okay. Oh my goodness. And it's something recent. Look, I don't know about something that I've recently seen, but I would always suggest to buy a book written by an African. Okay. It's like one of the things that started my curiosity with coming to Africa. Mm-hmm. And I feel like books in general just changes your life. I mean, like as many as you can read, as many as you can get in there. Do you
have one in specific that you could point people to?
I'd have to say, gosh, man, how to choose just one. I studied literature. Like I love books. This is hard, man. It's hard. But I mean, I guess you can't go wrong with like Chinua Achebe, like the boss man.
Yeah.
Can't go wrong with anything from Papa Achebe. But there's so many. I mean, there are just so many amazing African writers that you can choose from. But if there is art that's accessible in many places, and I like to hold the book. I know you said physical. I like to hold the book and hold on to the book and read it again. So I would definitely say a book.
Awesome. All right, and Kiki, if I can guess, is it Chimamanda?
Yes, Chimamanda is one of them. Chinua Achebe is another one of them, and those are legends. And I've found that it's nice to discover like young African writers. Mm-hmm. Again, like you said, the internet is literally the best place. If you want to like consume more African media, you definitely should look to reading. Actually, very important, because reading is like the foundation of every other thing. Like listening to African music, there is a lot of storytelling that goes in on the music. And because it's less pressure to be perfect or to tell the perfect story, people literally say anything. And sometimes we laugh at the lyrics, oh, this doesn't make any sense. But it's documentation. And for us as Africans, documentation is our survival. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, when we go back to colonialism, the biggest tool that the white people had, against all the countries that they colonized was erasure. They stole all the arts that they could steal and they burnt the rest. And many people don't know their original, like historic language as a result of that. So people had to depend, even in the US, the slaves the people that were sold off into slavery had to depend on using word of mouth to tell their children about the motherland. And even though that history is skewed somehow now, we're in a generation where we have a chance to properly document. So I do not look down on any kind of silly lyrics, no matter how silly it is. It's documenting context, it's documenting language, it's documenting love, is documenting ridiculousness and everything that has to do with Africa. So music for sure. Books, I'm so sad that I cannot give you like names, but you should find like there is always a community. It doesn't have to be a full African community. Like think of any country. For example, as a Nigerian, I know that I don't know why we keep traveling, but every single corner of the earth you go to, there is a Nigerian community. So, I always try to exactly find what they're listening to, what they're reading, and the art that they're consuming. When it comes to art, the British Museum, you would find all our art there. It's not somewhere I like to encourage people to go to because it's not supposed to be there. That's our art. It's supposed to be back home. But yeah, if you want to learn, unfortunately, you might have to go to somewhere like the British Museum to learn about Africa. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, great. And William, what about you? What piece
I'm
would you give?
I'm going to cheat a little bit and do a bit of self-promotion and say that
Nice.
folks should Africa as a country, because I think as a website, part of what we do is sort of include lots of recommendations of literature, film, and music for people to check out, which I think it's a very great resource if you want to find out what you should engage. So I'm gonna just say that, but I want to make a point related to something Kiki just said on the importance of documentation. I think another important thing is also kind of revisiting what was documented in the past, so sort of the archive. And I think, my perennial worry of me, and I think a lot of people, is that we have treasures of film, literature, and music from the past that is just getting lost. There's lots of books that are going out of print that you can't find anywhere anymore. Lots of films that are going out of circulation that you can't find anywhere anymore. Lots of music that isn't being pressed anymore. And I think the tragedy is that the efforts to try and revive a lot of this trove of culture that we'd been producing in the past and producing in difficult circumstances like during colonialism and the stuff and the like, a lot of the efforts to try and revive that are happening outside of the continent. So I think that something, that our generation should strive to do more of is sort of reconnect with that past, which I think can often sort of illuminate a lot of the challenges of the present, to see that in many ways, the problems that a lot of artists and writers were grappling with back then have not changed. So how do we sort of break the wheel that's in constant repetition? And I find that's one of the reasons why I think the connecting with that past can be important.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. That's amazing, because it does tie into the next one as well. So, so you've talked about how, both of you actually have talked about how there is that need for reconnection, right? And we've kind of touched a little bit on how the internet has played into, African people in general, but it's allowed people to be more expressive. It's created opportunities for creatives and people to produce their own art. There are still barriers within it, right? There's, still a ton of Africans who do not have access to the internet, right? So there's tons of stories which aren't being told, and also access to, like you're saying, languages, Kiki, like you mentioned, right? Pieces of culture and stories which aren't really being communicated. So I'd like to address this question for time specifically to Makeda. How does this factor, obviously the internet creating this space for you and for Africans in general, how does it factor into your creative process, knowing that there's tons of Africans who do not have access to this new technological advantage? How does it impact your creative process, being in that space? Does that make sense?
Okay, from how I understand it, it kind of inspired my, I guess you could say, creative process in terms of this kind of storytelling, because it's where I looked to find information and I could not find that information. And so I wanted to put that information there, and so it inspired it to begin with, and it kind of still does. Of course, now I want more people to see it, but it's this internet thing, it's like a train. We're not going backwards, we're going forwards. Whoever doesn't have a phone in their hand now or data in their hand now, they will soon and very soon. And this is like across the board. I'm talking hopefully soon, I would say majority, hopefully, of Africans will have a phone in their hand, right? And access to internet. There are efforts ongoing and they are strong to get everybody
Mhm.
with a phone in their hand. And so I don't feel like it's going to be that much of an obstacle much longer. But coming from, so I started out in media when I came to Rwanda, I started out in radio, and that was like the #1 form. Everyone had a radio. And so I started with my radio show there, and I saw the impact of that. And I mean, it was mind blowing. I mean, I was like nobody, and so many people heard what I was saying on a daily because I was on this radio. And I feel like, you know, the internet is kind of doing that in a different way. There's just so much more, you know, there's so many resources. And so there's kind of more responsibility, and it's harder because you don't know how to make sure that your message is not only being heard the right way, but is actually getting out there, you know. It's more of a job. But for me, I think the question was, you know, how does the internet kind of impact the way that I tell my stories, and who's getting, and who's hearing those stories. I mean, I know every project that I do, I start out with like a specific intention, and especially now, what I want to do here and what I want to say, and who do I want to hear it, and how do I want them to hear it, right? And I feel as long as you know that, as long as you're clear with that, everyone's on the internet. If they're not on the internet, they're going to get on the internet soon, and they'll hear it the way, hopefully, that you wanted it to be heard, you know. But for me, I was incredibly inspired by the internet, and so I still am.
Yeah, right. No, got you. And so I think I can address the next one to all of you guys. So now with the birth of, like, you know, the way the internet has kind of entered into African society now, right? In the past, there was an argument for in order to generate local demand, which is where we've seen countries such as, for example, Korea, South Korea, really blossom. Nigeria, for example, when it comes to African movies, right? Those so those countries have kind of like, you know, risen up on the back of huge local demand, right? And before, governments were faced with a task, and the Canadian government actually has a mandate that makes it so that for music and for films, for music, for example, on radios, 35% of all music played on the radio has to be Canadian, right? So it's in a bid to kind of get people listening to their own music, right? Now, where do you think the internet plays a part in that? And I'll ask this to you, William, in the sense that obviously it's allowed for people to, me and you, to have access to, for example, Ghanaian music, right? Where does it play a part when it comes to media in generating local demand, but also in the degradation of it, right? If you get access to, in this realm of globalization, we're all getting interconnected, we're all learning about new cultures, we're all forming like a huge global culture in a sense, right? Where do you think the internet steps into that? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Or is it not as easily defined as a binary situation?
Yeah, good question, and big question. And I think, you know, the answer is probably that it's not as easily defined as a binary. I think one thing is for sure is that it's here to stay. As yes. Makeda was saying, now the rate of connection is going to increase rapidly on the continent. And so the internet, conversations about whether or not its influence has been good or bad feel like they're besides the point, because there's nothing we can do about the rise of the internet. And it's about how can we channel it so that it can play a positive role. And so with regards to whether or not the internet can influence societies to generate local demand for their own cultural production, I think it's hard to know how to do that. But I think in societies where that has happened, it does require internet consumption to be happening simultaneously with strong localized efforts to stimulate that demand, to sort of encourage people, for example, as the Canadian government has done, as the South African government has also done in sort of placing quotas for which music on the radio is played, to do efforts like that, to try and drive people, for example, to cinemas. And let's say cinemas have to show a majority of local content. So I think there's a way in which, I'm answering in a very roundabout and long-winded way, but I think that we can't forget that the internet exists simultaneously with the material world. The material world itself hasn't disappeared, and the virtual hasn't replaced the physical. So there's a lot that you can do in the material world in order to predispose people to desire or seek a certain thing in the virtual world. And I think that, in fact, it's often there that you can actually try to cultivate local engagement with local content, such that your habits online will reflect your habits in the physical world. And that's probably the worry, is that we forget how powerful it is, that people still listen to the radio, that people still prefer to go to the movies to watch a movie rather than watch it on their computer. People, hopefully someday will be returning to concerts to listen to their music. So I think, we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, to be honest. It really isn't something as simple as, it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I think it's something that we all need to, especially as content creators, all of us need to consider, especially in the message that we're putting out there. Now, Kiki, I'd like to address a question to you, stepping aside from that for a moment, right? A lot of times when content creators from Africa rise, especially in the position that you're in as an investigative journalist, there's a lot of times there's pushback on that, right? And I guess the term that people use is it's dissent, right? It's dissident voices that are basically rising up and creating their own media. So I wanted to know, from your perspective, the work that you've done, would you say that your content is from a point of dissidence or dissent? And if so, how do you battle with that? How do you go against people who kind of like try to silence you in that space?
Well, I mean, as a Nigerian woman who identifies as a feminist, you might as well be a witch with a pitchfork. So definitely, I do get pushback from that, from even just speaking or speaking up in general. And I know that my work has provided me with some sort of platform and privilege that I try to use to uplift or amplify people in situations where they need it most. And, just if not for any reason, but for the fact that I've been in that space before, and the one thing I truly needed was someone to amplify my voice. So that's something that I take very seriously. And as you can imagine, there is countless efforts to try to silence. And, sometimes I have to admit, I do see the situation where it works. For example, where someone has spoken out and called out her abuser. And, we gather around a network of women to offer support and care and mental health and anything that is needed. And we do this out loud. We don't do it silently. And so, you become the object of oppression because your voice is very strong. So you just become the focus. You become the victim all of a sudden, and we forget about the person that's calling out her abuser versus the abuser, and it becomes a pure character assassination attempt. I say attempt because it's never really, successful, especially when you've done your due diligence. So when things like that happen, the next time you see a situation to help someone, you think twice. I mean, I've seen it happen to me before. I'm like, oh, do I have the energy for this? And then I just realized that, wait, isn't this silencing? Because this is the support system that you've built for women who don't have a voice. And if you let your own voice be stripped away from you, then you have silenced not just yourself, but many other people who are depending on your strength. And so, yes, every day I see different things like this for different contexts, really. Sometimes it's very political. Some people want to force a simple thing that you've said. They want to force it into one side of politics. And especially when you do not belong to any side of politics, They are both really just throwing the country, running the country to the ground, and you would like at least someone sensible to come up and step up to the plate. And so this is something that you face every day, and you need to learn to detach yourself from that. And you must not be lost in like that whirlwind, because usually I like to fight. I'm a fighter. I did not, get to this point by not being a fighter. I used to fight a lot. But do not underestimate the power of many people to band together to try to pull you down. And sometimes it's not your fight. There would always be a fight there. You don't have to join in. They would fight themselves. If they don't have you to fight, they would find somebody else to fight, and they would just keep fighting themselves. And you find that when you remove yourself from that situation, you might have a lot more clarity that, okay, these people just exist to fight, and that is not my whole thing. I have many other things to do. So you have to learn to detach yourself from that. But as for facing that opposition, I face it like every other day. Now it just feels like, fly on a windshield, and fly hitting your windshield will not stop you from driving, right? You have to keep going. And that's what it feels like right now, because I have not allowed it to be my problem anymore. So especially when you stay true to the work that you're doing and to the story that you're telling, I tell people, like, to tell a story, you must know that story. And that's just a line to speak to research. Do not play with research. Don't underestimate the power of confidence that can come from your storytelling, that will be super elevated with having the right amount of research, not being a person that is hijacking voices. You're amplifying, you're not hijacking. And when you do all that due diligence and the noise comes, it will literally just be noise, because you're super confident in the story that you're telling, and you're telling the story as not just your personal truth, but as a as a general and relevant truth to whatever story that you're telling. If you're telling the story of women in the Niger, you need to make sure that you're telling a story of women in the Niger, not your story of what you think the story of women in the Niger is. And so when that pushback comes, when that silencing comes, you just have to rely on the strength that you've built for a very long time, and just keep at it, really. It's not for the faint-hearted. I can't tell you that for free. But yeah, every day tests you anew. And even I can't even tell you what to anticipate. I just need to tell you to be ready. Yeah.
It's truly inspiring, to be honest. And I guess it is something that is common when people tend to speak out for the marginalized communities. Like William was saying, when you step into that space of giving a voice to the voiceless, a lot of people who, whether it's culturally, whether it's recent societal norms, have kind of silenced those voices and think that is should be that status quo should remain as such. They will often push back in ways that and I think, or rather what I would say is, I think what I'm also getting from you is that it turns up as noise from you, obviously, because you've been doing it for so long, right?
Yeah.
And for the people who are pushing back, it's kind of like you get the feeling that it's something deeper. Like, it's, people aren't just malicious, right? They've grown up with these kind of ideas, and obviously the internet now makes people a little bit more rash, what they say. You know what I mean? There's a level of freedom at the moment that a face-to-face conversation like this wouldn't have when it's over the internet. So now, just in terms of voices, right? Makeda, I'd like to address this next question to you, right? In terms of your voice and who hears your voice, right? Who would you say is your target audience, right? And how would you say they are, they because obviously they keep coming back, right? How would essentially you say you are able to connect with them on a regular basis, right? So who are you speaking for, especially when you're telling your, when you're on when you're speaking, at TED Talks and everything like that? Who would you say is your target audience?
Oh my gosh, target audience. For the TED Talk, Actually, for everything that I do, I have to say, I kind of feel like, I don't even know how this is going to sound, but I kind of feel like I'm talking to myself, and saying some of the things that like I want to know, some of the things that I wish I had known. So that can, I mean, that goes between like everything that I've seen until now, right? So like young people, you know, in their 20s or even sometimes teens, older. A lot of times in my content up until now, I've been talking about Rwanda. So that is like everything that's around, that's culture, that's language, that's, you know, things to do, that's places to go, that's, you know, everything having to do with Rwanda. So for that, it's like people who are interested in Rwanda, right? But for like social media, for instance, I would talk about like a lot of other things. And it would just be, I think, like what a lot of us do, the stuff that I am interested in, you know? And so a lot of times when I'm making my content, I'm making it for myself. And that's kind of how I've been doing it with what I'm working on now, which is, you know, more TV and films. I'm making the stuff that like I really want to see and that I've been wanting to see for some time, you know, and things that are, let's say, similar to things that I'm so happy when I see them and I just want to make more of them, you know? So I'm kind of just, yeah, it sounds weird, but yeah, I'm making it for myself and for people, you know?
Yeah, no, completely. I don't think it sounds weird at all. It actually ties into the idea of being the change that you want to, you know, see in the world, right? Is that creating the content that you want to see. And what's great is that you find that there's a ton of people who want to see stuff like that. And I feel like for people who are aspiring to do what you do, for example, right, and aspiring to enter into that space is a little bit of a worry sometimes that people kind of have like, well, people really want to see this content, right? Like, I know I want to see it, but will people actually really resonate with this? Right. And it's an interesting,
sorry.
Yeah.
That was kind of a beautiful thing about starting before all of the, I guess, influencer huge thing happens, you know, with social media. It's kind of one of the nice things about starting way back then was because I wasn't doing it for a million people to see it. You know, I was doing it for a few friends back home, a few people who wanted to see, you know, things that I was talking about, and then seeing so many people resonate with it, so more people watching, more people talking about it, then you realize, hold on, I have a community here. This is not just my story. This is, you know, a bunch of people. So yeah, sorry to cut you off there. Keep going. You're doing a good job.
No, that's great. No, that's great. I think it really does resonate. I think with a lot of people will need for sure as well, you know. Stepping into a space and just kind of being like, you know, you're not sure in the beginning if people really want to see that, right? But to you, it's something that needs to be done, right? And it may not be, you know, for a lot of people, it may not come as like, okay, this is a righteous thing to do. For you, it's just like, it's an inspiring thing to like, yeah, you really want to try this out, right? And then you just find that it kind of like, you know, cascades and you're getting more and more people who are resonating with that. So it's brilliant. And so, William, off of that now, for people who are aspiring to create their own art, their own media, especially Africans, right? In the current global situation with the internet, as we've discussed, all of that, right? How would you advise creatives to create media or, you know, to write, to produce, whatever it is, stories and art that is a reflection of their own community? Right. And this is tying into what essentially we were talking about in the beginning, right? What is African content? What is content that comes from the South African community, right? Is it necessarily something that has to be rooted in heavy cultural norms and something that obviously the West has never seen before or even considered as this is a South African piece of literature, or just as literature, right? So how would you advise people trying to create that content that reflects their communities? What would you say is an important place to start?
I think in a way, Makeda has actually just given the answer, which is that you should know your community first in an important way. So as you embark, I think the important step is just to start. But as you start, know who are the people in your immediate surroundings that inspired you to do this, that you feel like you are perhaps giving a voice, not without being a spokesperson, but helping to amplify, as Kiki was also saying earlier. And I think that if you can ground what you do in real concrete individuals and communities, if there are people that you can, in the process of creating what you create, it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a village to make content. And if you know who that village is and the people that you're engaging with as you make it, the people you go to for feedback, the people who help form your ideas, then that's how you can make content that reflects your community. Because as Makeda was saying, if it does have a bigger audience outside of that, then there'll be a cascading effect where it'll resonate outwards. But if it doesn't, then you are reflecting an important community. Even if it's a small community, it's still a very important community. And I think that that's probably the most important thing to do when you're starting out, is to not think about not trying to sort of in a very kind of formulaic way kind of clarify, who is my audience, but start with the audience that you know and that's very familiar with you, even if the audience is just yourself, if you're writing to yourself, even if it's just your circle of friends. And if you begin that way, then I think it's difficult to go wrong, because you'll know that there's always a group of people that what you do is going to speak to. And if your art is doing that, then it's valuable.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you for that. So everyone, we've kind of reached the end of the very, question ask kind of system that we've been going throughout the conversation. So I'd like to ask if there's anyone in the audience who would like to address a question to the entire panel or to somebody in specific, just to pick their mind for a little bit. I believe we have about 12 minutes left. So if there's anyone who has a question, any creatives, anybody just curious about what these people are up to and where to find them as well, I'll allow some time for that right now. So if you want, you could either unmute yourself or raise your hand, and we can unmute you as well.
I have a question. So Makeda, hello. Makeda touched on this briefly, but we're talking about if something that is not made by Africans is considered African art. And for example, the movie Black Panther is not, it's primarily targeted for Americans and African Americans. Some of the people in it and who made it were Africans, but it's about a movie and a country that does not really exist, and it incorporates some African cultures within it. So it does represent Africa in a sense, but what would you say is the impact of a movie like this? Because it's not a negative image, but is it really empowering, or is it helping like the African image, considering it's not even a real country?
Me?
Who's good?
I think anybody could speak on this. I mean, I can give you my opinion. I think that I was kind of thinking about that when I said, when other people make things about Africa, it can be appreciated, but is it African art? I don't think so. Did I have fun watching the movie? Sure, but I don't consider it African art. It's a movie that was made by a company that was based on a story that was based on a continent like Africa. You know what I mean? It wasn't even Africa. You know what I mean? So it was fun, and yes, they used some of the costumes, but I don't even know if we could even say they used the cultures. You know what I mean? They used languages, and they even mixed those up a little bit, and they used some of the accessories and things, but I wouldn't say it necessarily depicted African culture even really, it was just inspired by, and I liked it. I thought it was fun. I don't think it caused Africa any harm or our storytelling or anything, but what did it do? I think it made a lot of people think, well, we can be doing some big things like this. I mean, everybody went to go watch that movie, why don't we try and do something like that, you know? So I mean, it was fun to see. It was fun to see them use, you know, a bunch of different Africans in the movie and different African styles and hair, you know, voices like that on the big screen with that kind of budget. It was a lot of fun, but in terms of, you know, it impacting the culture here, maybe just inspiration, you know, gave us some inspiration, my opinion.
I'm with you 100%. It's not an African story. It's a very nice story. I enjoyed Iron Man. I enjoyed Spider-Man in the same way that I enjoyed. Obviously, yeah, I could feel some sort of connection to the music or, you know, to the style, because it was a really stylish film with like mad fashions, and you know, you can tell that they were inspired by us, but it's still not our story, unfortunately. It's nice to be inspired. It's nice to inspire someone to do something nice, the way that the foreign media has always inspired us to wear, you know, three-piece suits, which is not our culture. It's nice, but it's not our story. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement. I mean, the only thing I'd add is that, you know, similarly enjoyed watching the movie, thought it was a good time, but once again afterwards felt annoyed really with the sort of monolithic depiction of Africa, that there's some essential thing to being African, whether it's in dress or mannerism or in language. And I think it's just as problematic if it's done by people with your own skin color as if it's done by people of a different skin color. And I felt like that sort of critique ended up getting drowned out in the wake of the movie coming out. And I think we need to move beyond Africa, or what we understand globally to be Africa, something that we leave to sort of like the imaginations of people in the North, really. And it needs to be sort of reclaimed by Africans themselves.
Great, and I'll just add a point that I believe it's Naila has said on the chat. She says, great points. I think many of these films like Black is King and Black Panther have made Africanness as an identity for Hollywood to play with. And I think that's what you're all touching on as well, you know. So I believe Aisha has a question.
Yes, I do have a question. So the reason that we are able to enjoy the content that you guys make is perhaps because first it's online and also it's in English. And so I was wondering what do you guys think about this balance that we have to strike between kind of accessibility and working in preservation of our languages and not treating them as, you know, keeping them relevant to our lives in academia and just more formal ways and just conversationally. I know like Wole Soyinka started writing in Yoruba more. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is also writing in Gyuku, which I think is a shame, but also it's not something that I can be angry at or say that they should be doing that. It's something that I appreciate, but also it cuts off part of people that could enjoy it, but also are we the audience in the first place? So I guess, what do you guys think about that?
I think that's an important question that you asked. Are we the audience in the first place? I like to, you know, leave on a very hopeful note. Unfortunately, other languages, like other African languages, Nigerian languages, like other countries with sub-languages and even like adaptations of English, like Pidgin, would be othered. And that's just the unfortunate reality. And if you want to create content, and I'm not going to use the word accessible, because to be fair, when I want to make accessible content, I make, you know, not just English, I try to include other languages, because the most accessible language is English right now. So, but if I want to, you know, just preserve like the culture as much as possible, I do. even in the English that we speak, we have this thing called Pidgin English, or even not just Pidgin. Pidgin is even like deeper. Pidgin is a whole language that has been refused to be recognized as a complete language, whereas it is very similar to Patois that Jamaicans speak. It's very understandable, it follows the structure. It's very structured. It's not anyhow. It actually does have a structure. But yeah, I infuse whatever it is that I'm trying to include, like in the English. So when I say words like, instead of saying ogbono is a local dish, I would not try to find the English version of ogbono. I would say it as is, because that's what it is. It's an Igbo dish, and that's how I would, call it. And so these are little things that we're doing to remedy like an already bad situation that I have very little hope for. But I always love when people do like local language films, and local only because it's local to them, international to other people. I know I've watched French films, and nowadays I'm watching anime, and none of it is in English, and I quite enjoy it because, we're able to translate it into different languages. And I think that at the translations that the anime, the animes do is for inclusion, but, the original language that they use is not designed to exclude like anybody. It was designed for the Japanese, and it's their content. Like the point is to solely feed them first. Other cultures are welcome to engage. So that's what I really love and respect about them. And I look forward to like when many more African countries adapt the same. And there is also, I have to say though, when it comes to awards categories over the past 10 years, like little, I won't say a lot, but little has changed. For example, with what local language film means, what films, what categories can win awards, etc. And every time you see, this annoying thing is every time someone speaks up against it, there is pushback from Africans themselves. It's like we're scared of change or something. If someone says, oh, this category doesn't make any sense, we say, oh, why are we waiting for Western validation? We're not waiting for Western validation. If we are to interact as cultures, because the internet has made us very flat, if we're to start interacting with the films as much as we do, also deserve a space there, and they interact with Africanness. As Nyla says, it's now a thing that Hollywood has played with. And if Hollywood wants to keep playing with Africanness, why don't we have categories in your films? Why don't you recognize African films and award them accordingly? So because people are chasing awards, they have to do things like speak English is 75% of the film so that they can be eligible for an award. And I think that, once we start to challenge things like that, as a creative, you're able to create in the way that you feel most comfortable in your language or in English, like whichever one is true to you. There is no limitation of, oh, it will not be accepted into this award or not, anymore. So that's it as per films. As per books, I think the same rules might apply as well. A friend of mine, her name is S.I., she types Benin language, and I tried to, she sent me to edit, and I tried to put some things in italics, and she said I shouldn't do that. I'm othering her words, and I shouldn't put like the Benin words in italic, and I'm othering her words. And she taught me something there. Like, why don't I put the English word in italics? Why am I putting the Benin word in italics? So I'm learning and growing every day, but I have to say that sometimes the rules work against us. I can take a stand from now to tomorrow to only speak Igbo, but that means that my content will not go far in terms of recognition. And that's very unfortunate. And I think that we can start with fighting those systems.
Fantastic, great. I think for the sake of time, we'll ask the last question. Leila, you can ask. I believe one panelist can address the question. We need to wrap up. But Leila, what's your question?
Yes, first of all, I apologize for my voice. I'm sick, but I want to ask this question. And my question is actually to Mr. Shoki. So thank you so much for your great insights. I'm soon going to be studying journalism myself, and I've been through I've read a little bit of your articles, and what I appreciate is how you speak the truth about what's going on in South Africa and other parts of the continent. So you talk about issues of class, of race, of capitalism and colonialism, and I think we forget about how all of these issues are connected. And sometimes I have problems with fellow Africans, people of African descent, or born and raised on the continent, or born and raised in the West or elsewhere. And what I find it was just driving me insane is that a lot of us do not want to admit how things are going. So a lot of us, I think, sometimes internalize the European linear progress of like, oh no, it's going to be great, it's going to be like that. No, we don't have to talk about this, or just literally get upset when we talk about people, yes, are starving, because we're kind of traumatized about white people only saying that Africans are starving, but there are really people suffering. And I don't like how sometimes we just think, okay, there are more Africans with cars now, there's a bigger class divide now, and that's all right. I think that's wrong. So I wanted to know, what would you recommend to someone trying to have these conversations within internet? I also think that it needs to be intergenerational, but among Africans and people of African descent, without being able to balance talking about the issues of the most vulnerable, and also being able to portray Africa for what it is in all of its differences. So how can we decolonize while simultaneously ensuring that everybody is being represented? You know, not falling with the just colonial, it's starving, and just, wow, we got hotels. Because personally, I don't give a shit about the rich hotels in the African continent. You know what I mean? So how can we keep decolonizing and keep making sure that we don't forget those of us who suffer the most, whose parents did not immigrate in the West, and who are still looking forward to perpetuate their cultures?
Yeah, thanks, Lena. That's a great question, and I hope you get well soon. Sorry to hear you're sick. I think similarly, I started writing driven by similar frustration, and I think the way you sort of balance trying to portray places as they really are, but without sort of collapsing it into the sort of economist Africa's the heart of darkness type narrative, is to represent things accurately, to acknowledge the problems, acknowledge the class divides that are building, acknowledge the ways in which elites have betrayed the power that has been bestowed upon them. But at the same time, I think, and this is fundamental for me, is to recognize the agency of the people themselves, which is to say that what doesn't get represented is the way that people are resisting, the way that people are cognizant of their own circumstances, and rather than simply accepting their fates, they're doing something about it, right? So the way to keep decolonizing is to talk about how decolonization is this ongoing process. Just as in the middle of the 20th century, people fought against the colonial powers, now people are fighting against the comprador bourgeoisies that have replaced those colonial powers. And they themselves are the ones who are saying, we're not going to take this lying down. We think it's bullshit, and we want to fight for a better world. And that better world is not something that is going to be given to us by a sort of capitalist blueprint. It doesn't look like fancy hotels for us. It looks like us having access to our basic needs and being able to lead lives of flourishing, to be able to participate in community, to make art together, to structure society that is more humane and more just. And so I think that for me is the most important thing, is to acknowledge the problem, but at the very same time to recognize the agency of people who also see the problem, but are doing something about it.
Thank you so much.
That's great, guys. I think that brings us to the end of the conversation. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's on the call for your time. I think it was a really inspiring conversation, and I hope that you were able to walk away with something useful in your own lives. And to the panelists, thank you. You really have brought a lot of issues and a lot of perspective into what it's like being an African that creates their own media, and how we should go about consuming media as well. So yeah, now I'd like to yield the floor to Joy so she can tell us what happens next.
All right. Thank you very much to all our speakers. Thank you to Cinque for being the moderator. This was a very insightful discussion, and I'm sure we all learned a lot. And sorry. Oh, I thought for a second that I was still muted, but we will now be moving to the discussion and networking session. This is targeted mostly for the attendees, but three two of our speakers and our moderator will be able to stay on. And so I'll let the participants move to the different breakout rooms depending on who they want to speak to. And if you would just give me a moment to create those. After that, there will be intermission before we start the next panel at 11:45. Thank you. Okay, you should be able to join the breakout room of your choice now. And thank you again to everyone who was able to make it. And we hope to see you in the next panel.
Ulindlela pema mkopozi,